My friends, every generation is tested by tragedy. We look into the face of violence, we hear the echo of a gunshot, and we wonder who pulled the trigger. But the harder question, the one that demands more courage, is not just who, but why. What motive, what hatred, what brokenness leads a human being to raise their hand against another? Charlie Kirk's killing, whether one sees him as a hero, a fighter, or simply a man with convictions, forces us to confront the darkness that lives in society and, yes, within ourselves. But here's the truth behind every act of violence. There is not just a finger on the trigger. There is an idea, a motive, a belief that hatred will prevail over hope. History shows us that assassins may silence a voice, but they cannot silence the movement that voice carried. Abraham Lincoln was shot, yet liberty marched on. Martin Luther King Jr. was gunned down, yet justice kept rising. John F. Kennedy was assassinated, yet courage still inspired millions. And so the question for us today is not merely who pulled the trigger against Charlie Kirk, but what do we do now? Do we surrender to fear, division, and the poison of anger? Or do we rise up stronger, more determined, more united than ever before? The real motive we must trace is not only the assassin's, but our own. What drives us? Are we motivated by bitterness or by building a future? Do we live as victims of circumstances or as victors over them? When we hear the phrase, "Who pulls the trigger?" our minds instinctively picture the person holding the gun, the assassin in the shadows, or the figure whose hand delivered the fatal blow. But if we stop there, we miss the deeper truth. The act of pulling a trigger is not merely the mechanical squeeze of a finger. It is the final step in a long chain of thoughts, beliefs, and poisons that fester in the human heart. Violence never appears in a vacuum. It is born of motive shaped by ideology, fed by resentment, and carried by fear. To understand why someone would take the life of Charlie Kirk, or anyone for that matter, we must go beyond the surface act and peer into the human condition that allows hatred to win over reason and bitterness to conquer hope. The assassin's hand may be steady, but the roots of the action grow from a soul unsteady, wounded, and driven by forces often larger than themselves. History is filled with names of those who pulled triggers, but behind each name there is always something more, an idea, an emotion, or an unresolved anger that gave strength to the act. John Wilkes Booth did not simply fire at Lincoln. He carried the resentment of a fractured nation. Lee Harvey Oswald did not just aim at Kennedy. He carried within him disillusionment, envy, and ideological confusion. James Earl Ray did not merely take down Martin Luther King Jr. He acted with hatred of equality and fear of justice. The pattern is unmistakable. Before a bullet flies, an idea already pierces the heart of the one who fires it. The physical act is simply the tragic conclusion of a battle already lost in the mind and soul. This is why the question of who pulls the trigger must be expanded. Yes, an individual carries out the act, but society often bears responsibility for planting the seeds that make such an act possible. A culture drenched in division, hostility, and dehumanization creates the perfect breeding ground for violent actions. When voices are demonized instead of debated, when opponents are cast as enemies instead of fellow citizens, the temperature rises to a dangerous boil. Suddenly, pulling a trigger becomes, in the twisted logic of a misguided individual, an act of justice, vengeance, or necessity. But let us be clear, it is never justice, it is never necessity. It is only cowardice masquerading as courage. To reflect on Charlie Kirk's death in this light is to realize that the assassin's finger is not the full story. Somewhere, long before the shot rang out, words had poisoned the well, divisions had deepened the wounds, and anger had been allowed to grow unchecked. The person who fired may have carried the weapon, but the weapon itself was loaded by years of bitterness and indoctrination. That is why the real battle is not only in preventing weapons from being used, but in confronting the motives that lead people to violence in the first place. Unless we face those motives, whether they be envy, fear, political hatred, or personal vendetta, we will continue to see history repeat itself with new names and new tragedies. Yet, in this recognition, there is also a powerful lesson for those of us left behind. If the assassin's trigger is fueled by bitterness, then our lives must be fueled by hope. If their motives are born of division, then our response must be unity. If their hatred aimed to silence, then our voices must grow louder, bolder, and stronger. Because the truth is, no assassin has ever truly won. The hand that pulls the trigger may stop a life, but it cannot stop an idea. It cannot end a dream, nor can it silence a movement that is rooted in the hearts of many. The names of Lincoln, King, and Kennedy still live on, not because their assassins were powerful, but because the causes they fought for outlived the cowardice of those who tried to kill them. So when we ask, who pulls the trigger? Let us not only point to the figure in the shadows, but also examine the deeper sickness that makes violence possible. And more importantly, let us each examine ourselves. Are we adding to the poison of division with our words, our actions, our grudges? Or are we healing wounds, building bridges, and being voices of reason in a chaotic world? Because every one of us contributes to the environment in which hatred either dies or thrives. The assassin's hand may have ended Charlie Kirk's life, but it is within our hands to decide whether his death becomes another page of despair or a chapter of transformation. The trigger was pulled by one, but the future will be shaped by many. Let us choose to build, not to destroy. Let us choose to rise, not to fall. And let us remember always that while violence may have its moment, truth and courage endure far beyond the echo of a gunshot. When we think about violence, it is easy to focus on the weapon, the bullet, or the act itself. But the truth is, the method of destruction is never as important as the motive that drives it. A gun can rest quietly in a drawer for decades without harm. It only becomes a tool of tragedy when a motive breathes life into it. A trigger may be pulled in an instant, but the thoughts, emotions, and twisted beliefs behind that moment have been building for months, years, sometimes even generations. To understand Charlie Kirk's killing or any act of violence, we must shift our focus from the mechanics of the crime to the meaning behind it. The real power in violence does not lie in the tool used, but in the motive that feeds the decision to act. Every assassin throughout history carried a motive that guided their hand. John Wilkes Booth believed he was defending the South from a tyrant. Lee Harvey Oswald imagined himself striking against an oppressive system. James Earl Ray was fueled by hatred of the civil rights movement. The weapon in their hands was not their strength, their conviction, no matter how delusional was. This is why motive matters more than method. Remove the gun, and another tool could be found. But if you remove the motive, if you dismantle the hatred, the fear, or the desperation, then you have removed the true spark that ignites violence. Guns, knives, or even words can destroy lives, but they only do so when guided by a motive that convinces someone destruction is justified. In the case of Charlie Kirk, the world may debate endlessly about how he was killed or who exactly carried out the act. Yet the greater question is why. Was it political hatred? Was it a desire to silence a voice that spoke loudly about unpopular truths? Was it fear of the influence he held or resentment toward the movement he represented? These motives matter more than the weapon, because once we understand the motive, we can begin to confront the root of the problem. We can begin to see that the assassin did not simply pull a trigger. They embraced a belief system that told them violence was the answer. And that belief system is the true enemy. This truth challenges us to look deeper into ourselves and our society. What motives are we nurturing every day? Are we planting seeds of hatred through our conversations, our political debates, our treatment of one another? Or are we planting seeds of hope, compassion, and understanding? The motives that dominate society will always show themselves in action. If a culture feeds on division and demonization, then it should not surprise us when violence becomes the outcome. On the other hand, if we cultivate respect, dialogue, and unity, then peace becomes the natural fruit. The assassin's bullet may have ended Charlie Kirk's life, but the motive behind it was born in an environment shaped by words, actions, and choices long before that day. And here lies the challenge for us. If motives are stronger than methods, then our task is not only to regulate weapons, but to heal hearts. No law, no security system, no armed guard can fully prevent violence if the motive for violence remains alive and unchecked. The battle for peace is not fought only in courts or legislatures. It is fought in classrooms, churches, living rooms, and conversations between neighbors. It is fought every time someone chooses empathy over anger, forgiveness over vengeance, or courage over hatred. Motives are contagious, and if destructive motives can spread, so can redemptive ones. What we allow to dominate our thoughts and actions will eventually dominate our society. The motive behind Charlie Kirk's killing, whatever it may prove to be, is not just the assassin's burden to bear. It is a mirror held up to us all. Do we allow disagreement to harden into hatred? Do we let envy and resentment grow until they choke out reason? Do we believe the lie that violence can silence ideas? If we do, then we are indirectly feeding the same motives that lead to tragedy. But if we choose instead to rise above, if we embrace the conviction that ideas cannot be killed, that truth cannot be silenced, and that courage will outlast cowardice, then we are planting the motives of hope and resilience that no assassin can overcome. It is the motive that writes history, not the method. The gunshot may echo for a moment, but the motive behind it echoes for generations. What will be remembered about Charlie Kirk's death is not only how it happened, but why someone believed it should happen. And what will be remembered about us is how we responded. Will we allow destructive motives to keep breeding new acts of violence? Or will we replace them with motives of unity, strength, and love for truth? The choice is ours. The assassin pulled the trigger, but it is up to us to pull the world back from hatred and guide it toward hope. If we focus on motive more than method, we will not only honor Charlie Kirk's life, but also ensure that his death is not in vain. History has always carried a painful truth. While men and women can be silenced by violence, their ideas cannot. The lives of great leaders have often been cut short by bullets, blades, or prisons, but the ideals they fought for live on far beyond the sound of a gunshot. This is why it is said that assassinations are ultimately acts of futility. The assassin may imagine that by destroying the messenger, they are destroying the message, but the opposite usually happens. The death of a voice often makes the message louder, stronger, and harder to ignore. In the case of Charlie Kirk's killing, no matter where one stands on his politics or philosophy, the same truth applies. History has proven again and again that violence cannot kill ideas. Think of Abraham Lincoln. His presidency was marked by division and a nation torn in half by civil war. When John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger, he believed he was striking a fatal blow for the South, ensuring that Lincoln's vision for a united America would perish with him. Yet Booth's bullet did not destroy the Union. It did not resurrect slavery. It did not erase the Emancipation Proclamation. Instead, Lincoln became immortalized as the great liberator, and his cause became even more resolute. The idea of a free America, indivisible and dedicated to liberty, grew stronger, not weaker. Booth silenced the man, but he gave eternity to the cause. The same pattern repeated with Martin Luther King Jr. His fight for justice, equality, and civil rights shook the foundations of a divided nation. When James Earl Ray fired his shot, he believed he could silence the dream. But instead, King's death sparked an even greater urgency for the civil rights movement. His words, "I have a dream," became immortal. His courage became a rallying cry, and his dream spread far beyond his lifetime. The assassin may have hoped to stop history in its tracks, but instead he propelled it forward. The idea that justice must roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream only became more undeniable. Look, too, at John F. Kennedy. His youthful vision, his call to ask what you can do for your country, and his leadership during one of the most dangerous times of the Cold War inspired millions. When he was assassinated in Dallas, the world mourned. But his vision did not die. It continued through programs like the Peace Corps, through the space race that reached the moon, and through the enduring hope that America could lead with courage and conviction. Kennedy's death did not end his legacy, it sealed it. This same truth echoes in every age. When Socrates was sentenced to death, his enemies thought they were eliminating a nuisance, a gadfly to society. Yet his ideas about truth, virtue, and questioning authority spread far beyond his lifetime, carried forward by his student Plato and countless thinkers after him. Socrates drank the poison, but philosophy drank immortality. The method killed the man, but it could not kill the pursuit of wisdom. So when we look at Charlie Kirk's killing, we must remember this truth: the assassin may have ended his life, but they did not end his influence. If Kirk stood for certain convictions, then those convictions are now amplified. His followers, his listeners, and those who found strength in his words will not abandon them because of his death. They will cling to them more tightly. The assassin's motive may have been to silence, but the result will be to magnify. Violence always underestimates the resilience of ideas, and here lies the motivation for us all. We must never believe that the death of a leader or a thinker signals the death of their message. If anything, it places the responsibility into our hands to carry the torch forward. Each of us becomes the living continuation of the ideals that violence sought to bury. That is how justice survived after King, how freedom endured after Lincoln, and how courage continued after Kennedy. The same choice stands before us today. Will we allow fear and hatred to define the future, or will we let the sacrifice of a fallen voice strengthen our resolve to live with courage? A bullet can stop a heartbeat, but it cannot stop a movement. A gun can kill a man, but it cannot kill an idea whose time has come. The pages of history are filled with this testimony. Truth outlives lies, courage outlives cowardice, and ideas outlive violence. What happened to Charlie Kirk is a tragedy, but it is also a reminder. The assassin may have pulled the trigger, but they cannot write the final chapter. That belongs to those who believe that ideas matter more than fear, and that voices, even when silenced, can echo for eternity. A divided society is like dry timber in the forest. It only takes a spark to set everything ablaze. When people grow apart, when communities are consumed by hostility, and when opponents are painted not as neighbors but as enemies, tragedy becomes almost inevitable. Division is the soil in which violence takes root. It does not matter whether the weapon is a gun, a bomb, or a hateful word. The fertile ground of division gives it strength. Charlie Kirk's killing is not simply the story of one man's life ended. It is the symptom of a culture that has grown sick with polarization, anger, and mistrust. If we do not heal these fractures, we will see more names added to the list of lives cut short by hatred. Division is not new. History shows us countless examples where the breakdown of unity led to bloodshed. In ancient Rome, the Republic tore itself apart through political rivalry, civil wars, and leaders consumed with power. In the United States, the Civil War was the ultimate expression of division. One nation split into two, each side so entrenched in its vision that brother fought against brother. In both cases, the cost of division was not only lives lost, but also the erosion of trust, stability, and peace. Division weakens a society from within, leaving it vulnerable not just to internal violence, but also to external threats. A nation divided is a nation exposed. What makes division so dangerous is that it begins subtly. At first, it is simply disagreement, the natural clash of ideas in a free society. But when disagreement is poisoned with contempt, when debate is replaced by demonization, and when dialogue turns into dehumanization, the boundaries are crossed. At that point, the other side is no longer seen as people with different beliefs, but as enemies who must be silenced or destroyed. This is the breeding ground for extremists, the space where someone can convince themselves that pulling a trigger is not murder, but a form of justice. In truth, it is always murder, but division blinds people from seeing clearly. Charlie Kirk's death forces us to confront this reality. Whether one agreed with him or not, his killing was not born in isolation. It grew out of a climate where political hostility had been allowed to fester unchecked. It grew out of a society where people shout more than they listen, where outrage is rewarded more than understanding, and where unity is mocked as weakness. Such a climate does not simply create one assassin. It creates the conditions where many more might rise, each one convinced that violence is a reasonable response to disagreement. That is why division is so deadly. It multiplies hatred faster than peace can heal it. And yet there is hope. Division is not irreversible. Just as hatred is taught, so too can compassion be taught. Just as anger can spread like wildfire, so too can kindness ripple across communities. The key lies in recognizing the urgency of healing before it is too late. Healing does not mean erasing differences, Nor does it mean pretending disagreements do not exist. It means remembering that shared humanity is greater than political, racial, or cultural divides. It means learning again to argue without hatred, to disagree without dehumanizing, and to see even opponents as fellow citizens who deserve dignity. Unity does not come naturally in times of division. It must be chosen deliberately. It requires courage to break the cycle of outrage, to speak words of peace when others demand words of vengeance, and to extend a hand when everything in you wants to clench a fist. But history shows us that unity has power far greater than division. The civil rights movement triumphed not through violence, but through solidarity. The end of apartheid in South Africa came not through civil war, but through reconciliation, led by visionaries like Nelson Mandela. When unity is chosen, healing is possible, even after decades of division. For those of us reflecting on Charlie Kirk's killing, the lesson is urgent. We cannot allow division to keep setting the stage for violence. We cannot permit polarization to dictate our future. If we continue down the path of hatred, more lives will be lost, and the cycle will never end. But if we decide that we are stronger together, if we dare to build bridges where others burn them, then tragedy can give birth to transformation. Division creates the perfect climate for tragedy, but unity creates the perfect climate for renewal. A nation that heals itself from within becomes unshakable from without. A community that refuses to hate becomes fertile ground for peace. And a people who rise above division become the guardians of hope for generations to come. Charlie Kirk's death is a warning, but it can also be a turning point. The choice lies not in the assassin's hands, but in ours. When tragedy strikes, we often feel powerless, as though the course of history is written by the actions of those who choose violence. But the truth is that while we cannot control the assassin's choice, we can absolutely control our response. The response of a people, of a community, of a nation determines whether tragedy becomes a seed of destruction or a seed of transformation. The assassin's act may dominate the headlines for a moment, but it is the collective response afterward that writes the enduring chapter. Charlie Kirk's killing is a heartbreaking moment, but the real test is not in how he died, it is in how we choose to live in the aftermath. Throughout history, assassins have believed their actions would end a movement or silence a message. But they failed to account for the resilience of human beings to turn grief into resolve. When Abraham Lincoln was killed, many thought the nation would collapse into chaos. Yet the American people, through immense pain, carried on the vision of unity. When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, his enemies thought the dream would die with him. Instead, it became a rallying cry, and people of every color and background marched with even greater determination. The lesson is clear. Tragedy only wins if we allow it to breed despair. If we choose resilience, tragedy loses its power. In the case of Charlie Kirk, the response matters more than the event itself. If his death becomes an excuse for more hatred, for more division, then the assassin's true motive succeeds. Violence feeds on cycles, one act of bloodshed sparking another. But if his death becomes a catalyst for renewal, for courage, and for unity, then the assassin's act becomes meaningless in the face of hope. The real battle, then, is not over the trigger pulled, but over the response chosen by those left behind. Every individual has a role to play in this response. It is easy to feel as though responsibility lies with leaders, governments, or movements, but in truth, resilience begins in the heart of each person. How do we speak about the tragedy? Do we speak words that fuel bitterness or words that plant seeds of healing? How do we treat those who disagree with us? Do we mirror the hatred that caused the violence, or do we choose the harder path of respect and patience? These daily choices determine whether a culture becomes consumed by darkness or filled with light. It is not naive to believe that hope can grow out of tragedy. It is historical fact. Time and again, people have risen above unimaginable suffering to build stronger societies. After World War II, much of Europe was left in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, and millions grieving. Yet, instead of surrendering to despair, people rebuilt, and out of the ashes emerged democracies and alliances that have shaped the modern world. After September 11, 2001, America could have chosen only anger, but it also chose resilience, unity, and a renewed sense of national purpose. These examples prove that human beings are not defined by the blows they suffer, but by the courage with which they respond. Responding well to tragedy does not mean denying grief. Pain is real and anger is natural. But it does mean refusing to let grief turn into paralysis and refusing to let anger turn into hatred. It means taking the energy of sorrow and channeling it into determination. It means saying, this act of violence will not break us, it will make us stronger. That decision is not automatic. It must be intentional. And it is a choice that must be made again and again, each day in small and large ways. The response we choose also defines the legacy of those who are lost. If we allow tragedy to breed hatred, then the name of the victim becomes associated with bitterness. But if we use tragedy as fuel for growth, then their name becomes a symbol of resilience. Charlie Kirk's legacy, whatever one believes about his message, now depends not just on what he said in life, but on how people respond to his death. If they rise with courage, his voice will echo far louder than it ever could while he lived. So the question is not what happened, but what now? The assassin's decision is already written in the past. Our decision is yet unwritten in the future. We cannot erase the gunshot, but we can determine whether it becomes the sound of despair or the spark of renewal. The true power of tragedy is not in the moment of loss, but in the response of those who refuse to surrender to it. It is not the assassin who defines the future. It is the people who respond to the assassin's act. We can bow down to fear, or we can rise up with courage. We can choose bitterness, or we can choose hope. The assassin's hand may have ended a life, but it is our hands that will decide whether this tragedy ends a movement or gives birth to something greater. And in that choice lies our greatest strength. A bullet may end a heartbeat, but it cannot erase a destiny. Throughout history, countless men and women have been cut down before their time, yet their legacies live on because destiny is not measured by the number of years someone lives, but by the impact of what they stood for. Charlie Kirk's killing is a tragedy that shocks, angers, and wounds those who followed him. But even in death, the truth remains: destiny outlives death. Ideas, convictions, and movements do not die when a person falls. They survive in the hearts of those who refuse to let the story end with violence. Destiny is the unseen thread that ties a person's life to a greater purpose. When that purpose is genuine, when it is rooted in conviction and carried out with courage, it cannot be erased by an assassin's hand. Think of Abraham Lincoln. He never saw the full healing of the nation, yet his vision of liberty and unity endured long after his death. His destiny did not end in Ford's Theater. It continued in every amendment, every law, every act of justice that carried forward the principles he championed. The assassin tried to stop the man, but the man's destiny had already taken root in the soil of history. The same is true for Martin Luther King Jr. He knew his life was at risk, and in his final speech, he even acknowledged he might not live to see the fulfillment of his dream. Yet he spoke with confidence that the dream itself was unstoppable, and he was right. His destiny was not bound to the number of days he lived, but to the timeless power of his vision for justice. The assassin's bullet did not kill that dream. It magnified it, spreading it far beyond what King could have imagined. That is the power of destiny. It outlives the body and transcends the grave. In the case of Charlie Kirk, whatever one thinks of his politics or his platform, his killing underscores this same principle. His death may have ended his speeches, his interviews, and his personal contributions, but it did not end the movement he inspired. Those who listened to him, those who believed in his vision, will carry it forward. His destiny is now in their hands, and in many ways it will grow stronger because of the attempt to silence him. The assassin's action becomes a paradox. In trying to stop a message, they ensure it spreads even further. That is the irony of violence. It always underestimates the endurance of destiny. Destiny outlives death because it is not tied to flesh and bone, but to spirit and conviction. Flesh can be broken, but conviction cannot. A man may fall, but his words can continue to travel across generations. Think of Socrates. His enemies forced him to drink poison, yet thousands of years later his teachings still shape philosophy, ethics, and education. Destiny did not die in that prison cell. It leapt across centuries. This is why those who rely on violence always lose. They fight against something that cannot be killed. For those left behind, the question becomes, what will we do with the destiny that outlives the fallen? We have two choices. We can let tragedy harden our hearts and allow destiny to fade into bitterness, or we can rise to the challenge of carrying the torch. The first choice gives victory to the assassin. The second choice gives victory to the one who fell. Destiny is not automatic. It requires people to believe in it, to protect it, to live it out when the original voice is gone. This is the sacred responsibility of the living, to ensure that death is not the end, but the beginning of a greater chapter. When we look at Charlie Kirk's life and his untimely death, we must ask ourselves, do we see only the bullet, or do we see the legacy that still remains? If we see only the bullet, then we allow violence to write the final word. But if we see the legacy, then we become the authors of the next chapter. We become the proof that destiny cannot be destroyed. Every person who takes inspiration, every individual who chooses courage instead of fear, every voice that refuses to be silenced becomes part of the living continuation of that destiny. In the end, this is the message that tragedy cannot erase. Death may end a man's life, but it cannot end his impact. It cannot end truth. It cannot end courage. And it cannot end the destiny that was born the moment he stood for something greater than himself. Charlie Kirk's killing is not the conclusion of his story. It is the handoff of his destiny to those who will carry it forward. And as long as even one person chooses to live out that legacy, his destiny remains alive. So let us remember, bullets can stop bodies, but they cannot stop belief. Graves can hold remains, but they cannot hold destiny. Time may take away lives, but it cannot take away the power of ideas lived with conviction. Destiny outlives death, and that truth means no assassin ever truly wins.